All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mike White. I'm a professor at Arizona State University. And for this session, John Markovic and I are going to do a bit of a history lesson. Actually, John is going to start us off if I have things correct. So I'll turn it over to John.
Thanks, Mike. I think we've already started, but these are some of the meeting logistics we talked about at the beginning, so good. So I'm going to talk today about the body-worn camera policy implementation program. As I mentioned in the introduction, this is our 8th year, and we started the program in 2015. Vince touched upon this, but I just kind of want to give you an idea of what BJA is all about. So we provide leadership and services in grant administration across the criminal justice spectrum. Sometimes we think of policing, we think of the COPS office, but BJA, as Vince mentioned, is the largest grant-making agency under the Department of Justice, and we're under the general auspices of the Office of Justice Programs. There's other programs there, NIJ, BJ, Bureau of Justice Statistics, OVC, of the Office of Victims of Crime. There's some sites there that you can follow us. As I said, we started this program in 2015 when there was a call for accountability, transparency, and issues like procedural justice were at the forefront. The Federal Appropriations Congress provided us with, I think it was $22 million to support BWCs, but the instructions were that we needed to envelop these programs in robust, holistic programs, not just provide a technology tool. In that, we ran a grant program was written that the BWC programs were expected to be deliberate, comprehensive, and developed with broad stakeholder input. And I think we've seen evidence already of the benefits of that with Chief Noel's, I think, excellent, well-rounded, and very grounded presentation of what it really means to implement a body-worn camera program, all the dimensions. And needless to say, body-worn programs should be data-driven, evidence-based, and evolving. And again, Chief Noel, I think, provided a great example of that. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach. He mentioned adapting and revisiting the policy continuously, which is something you all should do. You have been working with a TTA provider in developing your policy, but that's not obviously a one and done. So it's been a competitive grant program. Those of you on the call, most of you are 2021 grantees, so you know that it supports the purchase release of body-worn cameras, but it really envelops other program areas. Key is the comprehensive BWC policy that you've developed deliberately with broad stakeholder input, or you're doing that. I think most of you have gotten through that milestone, and you were selected on the basis of, again, providing a holistic approach to the body-worn camera program. So promoting transparency and accountability, using body-worn cameras to improve constitutional policing, working in partnership with other stakeholders. I think an important element, and we've seen in some recent events, is we have 18,000 law enforcement agencies across the U.S., and oftentimes they need to work in collaboration, like we saw in the unfortunate events in Highland Park, Illinois. Although the events were unfortunate, I think the law enforcement response in that incident, the coordination was really solid. Hopefully we're seeing some of that evidence on the body-worn camera footage. Besides that, in rounding off, I think we want to see a commitment to BWC training, optimizing the evidentiary value of body-worn cameras, how they're being used by prosecutors, how you can use it to gather evidence. We'll have some talks about that, particularly how investigators are using body-worn cameras in innovative ways. I think that's up tomorrow. And a commitment to really managing the digital evidence. Now that more and more agencies have implemented body-worn cameras, we recognize that they're dealing with what the term that I probably overused, the tsunami of digital evidence data. Again, I think Chief Noel talked about that. It's not just the body-worn camera video, it's the dashboard camera video, the pole camera video, the video that's coming in from Ring doorbell cameras or citizens submitting videos from their cell phone. All that can be integrated. It's kind of a brave new world in terms of technology moving at a rapid pace, but we're trying to keep pace with that, and we know you as grantees are dealing with the challenges of that sort of onslaught of digital evidence. So historically, supported various types of programs. We really want to meet you where you are, where your needs are. So for the most part, we've supported broad-scale implementation at the outset, departments that want to provide body-worn cameras to all officers who have regular contact with the public. And they also have supported pilot programs, trial programs. Those are becoming less common as there's more water under the bridge. You can learn from your neighbors, and more states are now mandating body-worn camera programs. We've supported expansion programs. Some of those might have been pilot programs, or for instance, in the case of Los Angeles, several years ago, after implementing their body-worn camera program, they came back to us for additional funds to expand the program to transit officers. So we have some repeat customers, and some of you on this, among the FY 2021 grantees, may be returning customers. So that's the next bullet point. Multi-year awards are allowed. I think, really benefit. I think the other thing is, again, the collaboration. We've got the older sites that are presenting today based on their experience, bringing that to light for some of the newer agencies that are coming to terms with this technology, which is new to them, but certainly not new to others. This just gives you a snapshot of the 73 sites we provided funding to in our initial year of 2015. As you can see, diversely spread across the country. And here is the cumulative combined sites from fiscal year 15 to 20. I think I had meant to add 2021 in there, give you a little bit different picture, but we're really spread across the country. We see a little bit more of a tendency to apply from some states, and that varies from year to year. And I think now we're seeing more applications from states that are requiring body-worn cameras for all law enforcement agencies, but may not be funding them. We're seeing more states now funding body-worn camera, either through competitive grants or reimbursement programs. This is an overview of the funding to date. Generally, we've hovered around $20 million. Some of that is pulled off for training and technical assistance in 2018. We fell short of that. We had an abbreviated grant application window for a variety of reasons. But in 2021, our award amount was up to $35 million. In 2020, actually, we had about $20 million. We peeled off about half of that funding for the Small Rural and Tribal Micro Grant Program that Vince alluded to in his introduction. That's a streamlined program meant for smaller agencies. So smaller agencies can apply for the general BWC PIP. They can also apply for the SRT program. And in 2021, we set aside $4 million for continuation of that program. So $27.4 million basically went to the 94 sites, those of you who are on the call today, varying greatly in size and mission. And this is what the cumulative footprint looks like throughout the years, with the larger dots indicating more funding. So generally that corresponds with the number of body-worn cameras that agencies deploying. And here are the distribution of the 2021 sites. Again, a fairly broad cross-section, heavily concentrated this year in the Northeast and on the Eastern Seaboard. And this is just a snapshot. I won't go in detail over this, but the majority of our agencies supported to date, if I do my math correctly, about 80% are municipal and sheriff's departments, but we have a wide variety. What we like is the consortia agencies where they're bringing on partners. I think there's an economy of scale, and that in part, I think, was the impetus for our Small Rural and Tribal Micro Grant Program. Really the benefits of smaller agencies coming under the umbrella of an organization or an agency with grant experience is very beneficial. And this year we've got, I think, 3 unique types of awardees that we haven't had in previous years: a county district attorney, a county department of corrections, and a state investigative agency. So we're always learning new things about different types of implementation in sort of non-traditional law enforcement settings, not municipal police departments or sheriffs. So we expect to learn a lot from all of you, but some new things from those agencies in particular. Thank you. So moving forward, and we'll touch upon this more in our closing session, but we want to meet the needs of small, rural, and tribal agencies. We want to understand the ecosystem, how the field is changing. There's more and more state and local legislation that affects body-worn cameras and digital evidence integration. Federal legislation is coming to the fore, and federal agencies are adopting body-worn cameras in greater frequency. There have been issues when federal task forces have used locals, and the locals are required to use body-worn cameras, and the federal agencies frowned upon that legislation. And a study, sort of a process study on task forces, has, I think, moved the needle on that. Federal law enforcement officers will soon be required to wear body-worn camera footage. So we're looking at new ways to integrate and coordinate federal and local deployment of body-worn cameras. I touched on the next bullet point a lot. That's the tsunami of digital evidence. We want to continue. Chief Noel really hit on this again very well on using BWCs and practical purposes for training to assure policy compliance, to improve public relations and outreach. And then in 2022, digital evidence management projects that we're funding in this fiscal year, which will take effect essentially in 2023. We want to support those agencies that have established body-worn camera programs and are now dealing with the challenges and opportunities that digital evidence brings. So we're working with agencies where we solicited applications for this upcoming fiscal year for demonstration projects on optimizing footage, not just from BWCs, but from other audiovisual sources that can be integrated with those, how our prosecutors best using BWCs for evidentiary purposes, and how we can optimize BWC for constitutional policing, improving public relations and effective outreach and communication to the public. And then how do we optimize them for policy compliance? So those are things that we're looking for. Again, it's just an ever-evolving ecosystem, and with your help, we're trying to keep abreast of all those changes and how those vary across the country. And with that, I'll turn it over to Mike White, who'll continue our history of body-worn camera session. Thanks.
Thanks, John. And like John said, I'm going to continue the history lesson here. Just talk a little bit about where things started, talk about the present, what we know today, particularly with regard to the research, the evidence base, and then just look to the future and talk a bit about what's coming down the pike for everyone. So if we think about the past, the past or the history with police body-worn cameras is actually a little bit longer than I think many realize. There were some police departments in the UK that were experimenting with police body cameras as far back as 2005. And some departments in the US started rolling out at least some cameras in 2009, 2010. The interest was growing enough that the Police Executive Research Forum, PERF, held a one-day conference on the technology in the fall of 2013. And that conference led to the report that you see on the left of this slide, the PERF COPS report, which had some recommendations about policy and some ideas about things departments could do if they were making this early decision to roll out cameras. And about the same time that PERF was holding its conference in 2013, the Department of Justice, through the old Diagnostic Center, asked me to write a report that kind of just laid all the issues out on the table and talked about the evidence that we had to date. And that led to the report that you see on the right of this slide. So I guess my point is that the history is a bit longer than I think a lot of people realize. There was a kind of slow burning, growing interest in law enforcement, both in the US and abroad, in this technology dating back to really the early 2000s. But then, of course, in the summer of 2014 and in 15, there were a number of controversial incidents, police killings of citizens that led to public outrage, that led to protests, riots in some cities, and really a strong demand for police reform. And it was during this time that a lot of people really began to zero in on body-worn cameras as a tool that might be able to help in terms of police accountability, that might be able to help in terms of building community trust. And it was really those incidents and then the demand for cameras that emerged from that led to a really strong push for the technology. So in December of 2014, this would have been about 4 months after Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, about a month after the grand jury in Ferguson declined to indict the officer. In December, so just a few months after that, President Obama gave a speech at the White House. And this was an important speech for a couple of different reasons. One is that he announced a plan to reinvigorate the focus on community policing. It was also during this speech that then President Obama announced the formation of the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing. But the president also during that speech made a pledge for federal support for the purchase of up to 50,000 body-worn cameras with $75 million in federal money. So the federal government moved fairly quickly in terms of promoting police body-worn cameras as a tool that could help with some of the issues that were occurring with regard to trust and police accountability. This pledge that President Obama made really is the foundation of the grant funding program that you're a part of today. So the president gives that speech, makes that pledge in December of 2014. BJA really is tasked with delivering on that pledge. And one of the first things that BJA does is they host what they called an expert panel at the White House. And this was just a couple of months after the president's speech, late February 2015. They invited well over 100 really smart people to attend this meeting at the White House from all sorts of different professions: police leaders, union representatives, prosecutors, researchers, policymakers. Essentially, it was a giant two-day brainstorming session. I had the privilege, along with a colleague of mine, Chuck Katz from ASU, to facilitate this two-day meeting. And once the meeting ended, Chuck and I had a task along with BJA, which was to take all the information that was culled from this meeting from all of the experts and use that information to build, almost really from the ground up, the National Body-Worn Camera Toolkit. And BJA, Chuck and I, and several others spent months doing that. And the toolkit went live in May 2015. You can see the link is here. The toolkit, it's a fancy word for a website, but it's basically an information warehouse. It's kept up to date. So what you go and see has been updated. It's not just the same information from May 2015. And it's a place where you can go and learn about various aspects of the technology, whether you're a chief of police, a line officer, a civil rights attorney, a concerned citizen, a college student writing a paper. It's the go-to place for learning about this technology. And then, of course, the other thing that happened shortly after the expert panel, as we moved into 2015, was the actual rubber meeting the road with this grant funding program. And John gave you the latest stats. I wrote them down. As of today, 460 grant awards, $124 million, so far exceeding the initial pledge from the White House, and getting very close to almost 100,000 body-worn cameras funded through this program. The other thing to think about, it can get a little bit confusing when you think about, well, who are these CNA folks and why am I hearing from an ASU professor and BJA? There's really two tracks of support with this program. On the BJA side, you've got John and his entire team who help with the nitty-gritty of the grant management. And then you've got the TTA team, the training and technical assistance team, which is Chip and Brittany, the folks at CNA, Arizona State University, and JSS, Justice and Security Strategies. And our job is simply to provide support to you as you move through this grant funding program. And we do some of the things that you see on this slide. One of the big ones that you hear a lot about is the policy review, but hosting meetings like this. So that's the past. That kind of brings us from where things really got started and rolling to where we are today. We begin to think about the present. When we take stock of that 8 years that we've been involved in this, what have we learned over that 8 years? And I think the answer is we've learned a great deal. And there are two areas where I want to focus on. One is research. What has the research told us about body-worn cameras and their impact? And then the other is policy. What do we know about policy? But let's start with the research. When I wrote that report back in 2014, that initial assessing the evidence report, it was fairly easy to write because there were only about 5 studies that had been conducted to date. A couple of them were very good, like the Rialto study. A couple of them were really not so good. But flash forward to 2022, now we've got, I would guess, more than 150 empirical studies that have been conducted looking at a variety of different outcomes related to police body-worn cameras. So when we take stock of where we are right now in the present, I thought it might be useful to just think about a couple of the different outcomes where the evidence base has been fairly consistent. And I'll highlight a couple of those. The first is officer attitudes. That is, what do police officers themselves think of body-worn cameras? And there have been about 40 studies, so 37, I think exactly, studies that have looked at officer attitudes about cameras. Some ask officers via surveys or interviews. Some do before they're wearing cameras. Some only ask after. The really good studies are kind of pre-post where they ask the same group of officers before and after. But when you look at the body of that evidence, there's almost 40 studies. What you see is that officer attitudes are overall very, very positive about body-worn cameras, especially after they begin wearing the cameras. Those studies that do the pre-post, like I said, I think those are the ones that are the most valuable ones. And you see whatever concerns that officers have about cameras really start to go away once they're actually wearing them and have them out in the field. And the one area that I think is interesting, it's a consistent finding, is that officers are consistently pretty skeptical about how the camera presence during the scene is going to affect citizen behavior. This idea of a civilizing effect, the citizen's going to see the camera and whatever nonsensical behavior they're engaged in, they're going to stop immediately because they see the camera and they're being recorded. So officers have generally been pretty skeptical about that. The other area I think that is important to think about in terms of attitudes is the community. What do citizens think about technology? And there have been 14 studies that have looked at just kind of general population. What do communities or community members think about police body-worn cameras? And almost all of those 14 studies show that community members are overwhelmingly supportive of their officers wearing body-worn cameras. A area of this focus is not general population, but what about people who actually have encounters with police officers? So something bad happened, an officer responded, the officer recorded that encounter. What do those folks think? And there have been about 8 studies that have looked at those attitudes, that is, people who had interactions with police officers that recorded it. And I think a lot of people are surprised when they look at those studies. Also very, very positive attitudes about the technology. Procedural justice, we heard a bit about that from both the chief and John. There have been 5 studies that have looked at whether wearing cameras increases the procedural justice that officers engage in. And 5 studies is not a lot, but 3 of the 5 show yes, indeed. A couple more areas I want to highlight before I start marching to the future. One, there's been a lot of interest in officer activity. So what will happen when officers start wearing cameras in terms of the arrests they make, citations? Will they go up? Will they go down? And it's really been a mixed bag. In some studies, there have been reductions in arrests, and in other studies, they've gone the exact opposite direction. They've increased. So it's been a bit of a mixed bag. The one area where there has been consistent findings is officer proactivity. There has been some concern that when officers start wearing cameras, they'll view it as a surveillance device and they'll withdraw and they'll be less proactive, kind of the depolicing argument. And studies have looked at that, and there's been no evidence at all suggesting that this happens when officers start wearing cameras. Another area of particular interest involves the evidentiary value of the cameras, not for the police department, but for downstream criminal justice decision makers like prosecutors, public defenders, defense counsel, judges, and juries. And 8 studies have looked at the impact of body-worn camera footage on that downstream processing. The idea would be, okay, now we have footage, we've got audio and video. It should facilitate the processing of cases through the criminal justice system. And 7 of those 8 studies have shown that to be the case, that the footage oftentimes will enhance prosecution outcomes. And it really emerges in specific case types. Domestic violence, for example, is a case type where the footage really seems to be helpful. Another area is drug and alcohol cases, DUI in particular. We tend to see enhanced outcomes. But this is an area where we continue to look for more work, because 8 studies is really not that much compared to other areas where the evidence is more robust. The area where I wanted to spend the last of my attention on the research is what I call the 2 big ticket items: use of force and complaints. What happens to those 2 very important outcomes once your officers start wearing cameras? And I mentioned the Rialto study. Those results came out in 2013-14, and it really grabbed a lot of attention, in part because of everything that was happening during that time. But the results of that study, which was very rigorous, you can see at the top left of the slide, from 1 year to the next, an 88% reduction in complaints, a 60% reduction in use of force. Rialto is a small department. You can see the actual number of cases in parentheses there, but those are really, really stunning findings. And then there were some other studies that came out early on in 2014-15, like the Orlando study, that showed also very significant reductions in those 2 important outcomes. But as time passed, the evidence base got a little more mixed. There were some studies like the Milwaukee study where you see reduction in one of those outcomes, but not the other. And then the Washington, D.C. Metro study, where there was no impact at all on complaints or use of force. And I remember these results from the Washington, D.C. researchers. They were presented, I think it was the IACP meeting in 2017 in Philadelphia. And when they presented these results, it really caught people's attention. How could this be possible? How could you have a Rialto study that shows this and a DC Metro study that shows the exact opposite? So, one of our jobs as the researchers on the TTA team is to not get caught up too much in any one particular study, but rather to look at the body of evidence. And you can see that in the red. So, for example, there have been 32 studies that have looked at the impact of body-worn cameras on citizen complaints against officers. 24 of the 32 have shown significant or substantial reductions in complaints after officers start wearing cameras. That is powerful evidence. It's not absolute. We don't deal in absolutes in social science research, but 24 out of 32 studies is pretty strong. The use of force studies, not quite as persuasive, but still half of the studies have shown substantial or statistically significant reductions in use of force. And I know that Brittany put in the chat links to some outcome directories that we've created. You can see the link on this slide as well. If you want to check out the studies on any given topic, you can look at those directories, and we provide some descriptives of the studies and what they found, and you can kind of see for yourself what the body of evidence says on a particular topic. Remember, we're still in the present and what we know. So the evidence base has told us a whole lot over the last 8 years, and it'll continue to grow, which is a good thing. The other area where I think we've learned a great deal in the present is the importance of body-worn camera policy. Policy matters. Policy is really one of the centerpieces of this grant funding program. Your agency has probably been involved in the policy review process. Maybe you finished it, maybe you're still going through it, but our overriding philosophy in this program is that good body-worn camera policy will lead to good body-worn camera practice. We have devised a fairly robust policy review process so that we can work with you to make sure that your policy is comprehensive. It covers the key issues that should be covered. We have a session on Thursday where we'll dig deeper into the policy review process. The issues that we focus on, you see on this slide, and a lot of them go directly to some of the things that Chief Noel was talking about earlier this morning. The other thing we've engaged in is a policy analysis. We're looking at policy trends. So the report that you see on this slide looks at policy trends from almost 450 agency policies from agencies that have been funded in this program. So you can look at this report and see, okay, what do agencies typically say about activation? What do they say about citizen notification or officer authority to review or public release of footage following a critical incident? So tune in for that session on Thursday to hear more about the focus on policy for this program and what we've learned about policy over time. So then we talked about the past, talked about the present. What does the future hold? One of the things that we know is that things are evolving, things are changing. Certainly, this technology is evolving and changing. You heard Chief Noel talk about automated activation. Community expectations also are changing a great deal. The issues, the pressing issues that are going to face you are evolving as well. So lots is changing and will continue to change. The one thing I think we can hang our hat on as we look to the future and these unknowns are coming toward us is that local context is going to matter a great deal. And what I mean by that is what will work in Knoxville may not work in Sturgis, Michigan, or in Los Angeles, or in Seattle. Local context is going to matter for body-worn camera policy and practice. The chief mentioned public release of footage of a critical incident. What works in New Orleans or Knoxville may not fly in other parts of the country. Digital evidence management, the storage solution type you use, how you use your footage. The local context is going to drive this, what your community wants, what your officers want, what the expectations are. And this idea of a one size will fit all is simply not going to work with regard to body-worn camera policy and practice. That mantra of local context mattering also applies to the research that's going to continue to be done and the evidence base that's going to continue to grow. Why are there mixed findings? Why is it only 14 of 28 studies have shown a reduction in use of force? It's something that we've been thinking a lot about. And there are a couple of different explanations that I think are worth considering. One is, what's the state of the department before the department deployed cameras? Were they in crisis? Were they being investigated by the U.S. Department of Justice? Or were things really in good shape and they just adopted cameras as one more step in being a professional police department? So the starting point for a department makes a huge difference. What kind of planning and implementation did the department engage in before they rolled out cameras? It's something that we place a lot of emphasis on in this funding program. If you look back in time, the Ferguson Police Department, they deployed cameras 28 days after Michael Brown was killed. What kind of planning and implementation processes did they go through in 28 days? I would argue those planning and implementation processes were probably not very robust. So that makes a difference too. And then of course, not all research studies are created equal. A lot of the studies that have been done, like the Rialto study and others are very rigorous randomized controlled trials, but there's studies that are not that rigorous, that are not very good. And so we need to keep an eye toward that so that the local context also will influence the research findings that we see. Local context matters. This slide talks about the federal landscape, but probably more pressing for you all is the state level landscape. Probably 24 states now have passed some sort of legislation involving police reform. Many of those states that have passed legislation have body-worn cameras as part of that legislation, whether it be mandated use or in some cases the legislation that's been passed, like in Colorado, is very nitty-gritty in terms of activation and discipline for activation if you fail to activate. So the local context at the state level is going to make a huge difference. And then, of course, at the federal level, any sort of federal legislation that comes down. And John talked a bit about the issues that have happened over the last few years with some of your local officers serving on federal task forces and whether they could use their cameras or not. As John mentioned, that with President Biden's executive order, it looks like federal law enforcement officers are also going to be wearing cameras very soon. So bottom line is we think about what's coming down the pike, the future, what happens in your jurisdiction is going to be right for you, but that may not be right the next town over or departments in the next state over. And that's, I think, an important part to keep in mind. Hopefully we have some time for questions.
While we're waiting for questions, I think maybe put a little bit of a cap on some of the things Mike said. I think the diversity of research findings is interesting. I think Mike, a lot of the work that he's done, along with his co-author, Eileen Malm, really looks at the diversity. And as Mike alluded to, that not all agencies are starting at the same place. An agency in a bucolic suburb that has very little use of force and very few complaints is not going to see, by definition, much change. They're already low in both of those incidents. Those incidents, places like Rialto or larger cities that are facing, I guess, in more challenging environments that had historical issues with the community or some elements of the community, may see more use of force, may see more complaints, and those are areas where there's room for improvement. I think Mike and Eileen and others contextualize the research. It's not do body-worn cameras work, but in what circumstances do they work, what types of crimes and what types of situations, what types of encounters, I should say. It's going to vary. The question of do body-worn cameras work is kind of like saying, does medicine work? Well, it depends. Depends on what the ailment is. It depends on the particular medicine and how it's doled out. And as we're moving forward with research, I think it's important to really look for more context and more details rather than trying to answer that global question, do body-worn cameras work? I think Mike and his colleagues are on the right track with that.
Mike, I do see one question in the chat for you. The question I'll just read it to you, Mike. Has there been research that has discovered other unintended consequences with the use of body-worn cameras unrelated to use of force or citizen complaints?
Yeah, Brittany, that's a really interesting question. I think that the short, quick answer is no. The evidence base grew fairly quickly on cameras, probably as quickly as cameras were diffusing, but the focus really has been on just a handful of outcomes. And I focused on, or I highlighted most of those: use of force complaints, officer perception, citizen perceptions, evidentiary value, that kind of stuff for the department as well as for prosecutors. But in terms of unintended consequences, really, there hasn't been very much. And I read that as I was reading that question, I was trying to think of what Arif might be thinking about. Certainly one could be privacy. What is the impact of cameras on officer privacy, on citizen privacy, on victim privacy? But there are other outcomes of interest that probably deserve more attention. I know that there are a couple of studies that have been conducted, a book that was written focused on the kind of the surveillance aspects of the technology and viewing body-worn cameras as kind of one more piece in that surveillance apparatus.
I do see one other question for you. Does the research of officers' acceptance of body-worn camera programs show that they're more concerned about their senior staff, so watching their activity? We found skepticism rooted in Big Brother, watching their daily activities.
Yeah, especially the studies that looked at officer attitudes kind of earlier on in 2014, 15, 16. That was the primary concern, that officers either individually or through their unions were expressing concerns that supervisors would go on fishing expeditions. So you have a supervisor who doesn't like you very much, and he's going to spend the day going through all your footage, waiting for or looking for that F-bomb that you dropped or that one thing or that you said or did that now he can jam you up on. Certainly that was a primary concern early on. I think a lot of that has disappeared, and the concerns have evolved a little bit in terms of being less focused on how the department is going to use the footage and more focused on what the community is going to think, what the prosecutor is going to think, the potential for footage to be inconsistent with a report that you give, particularly officers involved in a shooting, and the officer maybe because of the rules and the law in a given area, the officer is required to give a statement before watching the footage, and then there are inconsistencies between what the officer said in the statement versus the video. So I think the concerns have evolved a little bit more beyond the concern about a supervisor fishing expedition.
Thanks, Mike. I see Chip has put a couple of thoughts in the chat, just additional research avenues for CNA or ASU or others out there. Other questions for Mike or John?
One of the things we're trying to pivot again to understand what types of research or what types of insights can be gleaned from looking at body-worn camera footage. So David Macon will speak later about some of the ways they're doing that. And I think we're just trying to get our hands on the metadata, the data about what's on the body-worn camera footage, what types of events are being recorded, and really trying to understand the variety of ways that metadata is captured. Big thing is how the data is tagged in terms of how long the agency has to retain that data, which in some states may be dictated by state laws or guidelines, but there's not a lot of uniformity or standardization in how data is captured and how it's tagged in the metadata. So we're trying to understand that terrain a little bit better, because I think just understanding body-worn camera footage is an inventory of what officers do, or a glimpse of what officers do, is important. And all that depends on the activization policies by the agency or imposed upon them in effect by the state. So it's really unfolding and complex. And Katz, Mike's colleague at ASU, recently did a study with Tucson or Phoenix where they looked at compliance and found out that compliance and turning on the cameras when they ought to increased when their policy shifted from activization at contact versus activization at dispatch. As you can imagine, activization at dispatch led to greater compliance because the officer doesn't have to remember to turn the camera on as they're encountering the person in the traffic stop, or whether they're walking up to the door for a call for service. So besides the outcomes research, that's very important. Just some of the process research still needs to be done to capture the variety of ways that BWC footage is being used in the majority now of the 18,000 law enforcement agencies across the country.
Thanks, Sean. And also thanks, Mike, for the presentation today. I will end this presentation, but let everyone know at the 2:00 hour, there are 2 different congruent sessions that you are able to attend. We have one that focuses on understanding the benefits of compliance checks and audits that will still be on this main Zoom. The second session is on pilot testing and evaluation of body-worn camera equipment that is on a second Zoom that you're able to access in Whova. And both of those sessions will start at 2:00. So thank you for joining us so far. We'll see you at the congruent sessions, and then we'll see everyone else again later today around 3. So thank you.